Hi, I'm Robert Wiseman. In the 1990s, I worked for Delta Airlines, where my wife and I redesigned Delta's frequent flyer system before I moved on to Delta.com. It was there that I first became aware of Bob Coggin, or as he was known, Mr. Coggin by the employees at Delta, who venerated him. A few years later, when I was Chief Technology Officer at Travelport and Bob was Vice Chairman, I got to know him a little bit better. So back in around 2004, I talked to you about writing a book. It took you a while. What finally made you pull the trigger?
Well, you know, I was inducted into the Business Travel Hall of Fame with Bob Crandall and Gordon Bethune. And that night at that ceremony, that induction ceremony, when I heard their stories and I heard one of my Delta colleagues tell my story, I said, hey, I've got to capture this. I've got to put this in a book so people in the future, people can know what I've accomplished at Delta Airlines.
And a great book it is. I read it, and I like to tell my kids that I came from humble beginnings, but reading your story, I have nothing to compare with. Can you give a little bit of color as to how humble your beginnings were?
Well, it was very humble. My mom and dad had a lot of marital problems in my very early years. And by the time I was in the second grade, they were divorced, and I was having to live with aunts and uncles and my Coggin grandparents on the farm. So I was very farm oriented back in those days. And my dad remarried my stepmother Vera, and we lived in a cotton mill village called Sargent, which is outside of Atlanta. And my dad later bought a farm, and we moved to the farm. And I literally spent days and days and days plowing a mule, plowing the cotton fields with a mule. And on a few occasions, my dad made me stay out of school to plow. We were behind on the plowing. So I had a very humble beginning.
And then you worked at Woolworths and finally went into the Air Force to try and escape your background, I guess, but had to move back from a hardship discharge to go back and help your mom. Then you went from a store clerk to a truck driver. How did you end up at Delta?
Well, I had an uncle. My uncle Tom Richards had worked for Delta, and when he found out that I was driving a truck, he said, you know, you should go to Delta and apply for a job at Delta. I'm sure you can get a job on the ramp in Delta. That would be a great job for the rest of your life. So I went to Delta and applied for a job as a ramp service agent, and got hired within a week.
And where were you a ramp service agent?
I was a ramp service agent in Atlanta, which was Delta's major hub in those days. It still is.
And what kind of things did you do as a ramp service agent?
As a ramp service agent, I loaded and unloaded bags. I went to the cargo facility and hauled cargo to the airplanes. I went to the mail facility and hauled mail to the airplanes. And everything related to loading and unloading an airplane, the baggage, the cargo, and the mail, and all of that stuff.
And then you became a station agent?
My boss in Atlanta, the station manager in Atlanta, observed how hard I worked, and there was a job open in Montgomery as a station agent, which that job came available, and I took it immediately, and went to Montgomery as a station agent. In a small city like Montgomery does everything. We take reservations over the telephone, we check passengers in for their flights, we load and unload their bags, we refuel the airplanes, and we do everything.
Now, everything includes figuring out the cloud ceiling for the aircraft?
Well, in Montgomery there was a weather bureau there, air traffic control operation there in Montgomery, so we didn't get involved in taking weather observations in Montgomery, but when Delta later transferred me to Hot Springs, there was no air traffic control facility there, and so we were kind of tasked with determining what the ceiling and the visibility was, so we could tell the inbound flight that the ceiling was X and the visibility was Y. So we had to make those observations and to determine the height of the ceiling, we would release a balloon and do a stopwatch, and when it disappeared, we stopped the stopwatch, and that's how we determined what the ceiling was.
Was it accurate?
Accurate to the degree that the person conducting the enterprise would make it accurate.
So you were clearly very ambitious. You set your sights on sales. How did you eventually get into sales?
Well, after Hot Springs, there was a job open in Brunswick or St. Simon's Island, which is where the airport was. It served Brunswick, and I transferred there. And while I was there, I met some of the people that worked for Mr. R.J. Reynolds and Mr. Reynolds himself. And Mr. Reynolds decided to start an airline, and he hired me he recruited me away from Delta to come work for him to be his sales guy, to start calling on the corporate accounts around in the markets we were serving, and that's how I became involved in sales.
And what year was this?
That year would have been 59.
59. And how long did you work for RJR?
Well, I didn't work for him but a few months because Mr. Reynolds married and got remarried, and his new wife wanted to move to Europe. So Mr. Reynolds decided to shut Golden Isles Airlines down and move off to Europe. So, but what he did for me, they placed a call to Mr. Woolman, Delta's CEO, to get Delta to take me back. And Mr. Woolman arranged me to come back to Delta. I went back to Montgomery, but I did it without any loss of seniority. My seniority continued through that whole process. So I really was really fortunate that Mr. Reynolds got involved with Mr. Woolman and got me back on at Delta.
And the position at Delta was sales?
The position at Delta then was back station agent in Montgomery.
So how did you get into sales at Delta?
Well, Delta had a sales manager in Montgomery, and I started making sales calls with him. And he told me about a sales job that had been open in Washington, D.C. for 6 months or more. And so I expressed an interest in that Washington sales job. And Delta had some difficulty finding anybody who wanted to take that job. So I got the job and moved to Washington. And my wife, Millie, was working for Delta in Washington. At that time, she was a secretary to the Government Affairs VP. And I met her there, and gosh, within a year, we were married.
Then various opportunities took you to Mississippi and Philadelphia, and then finally to the New York market. That was a big move. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, when I was in Philadelphia, district sales manager in Philadelphia, Delta called me and says, Bob says, New York job is, district sales manager's job is open, and we want you to go to New York. And initially I said, no way am I going to New York. But after thinking about it for a couple of days, I said, this may be the best opportunity of my life. So I called him back and said, yeah, I'll take that job in New York. So I went to New York and spent over 11 years in New York.
From what year to what year, do you remember?
I would have gone to New York I left New York in 79, so back it up 11 years.
68.
Yeah.
And was Delta a big presence in New York at the time?
No, really, Delta primarily served the southeast markets. We served Charlotte, Atlanta, New Orleans, Houston. I'm going to say we probably had roughly a dozen flights out of New York at the time.
And then there was a merger with or purchase of Northeast?
Yeah, in August of 72, Delta and Northeast merged. It was more an acquisition than a merger, but it was called a merger. And we, for the first time, we were flying to the Florida markets and to the Bahamas. So all of a sudden, we went from just a business-oriented carrier to a business and a leisure-oriented carrier, and serving the Florida markets and the Bahamas. But it was a real struggle because Northeast didn't have much of a footprint in the market. They were tiny compared to Eastern and National, who were the primary carriers. So my challenge was to create awareness that Delta was now flying to Florida and the Bahamas out of New York. Well, thankfully my mother, I inherited some creative thinking from my mother, and I'll give you a good example. Most of the people that work in Manhattan commute by rail from the various suburban cities, and there's big parking lots at all the train stations. And so I had to brainstorm as winter was first winter was approaching, to order several thousand ice scrapers and have the people that worked at the airports, go to those train stations and put those ice scrapers under the windshield wipers. And there was a message on the ice scraper that says, Delta now flies to Florida. So that created an awareness that we wouldn't have had otherwise. But probably my most creative idea, I knew about a guy over in Jersey that had a stagecoach. And I rented his stagecoach, had a big banner made that says Delta now flies to Florida, put on top of that stagecoach, and went up and down the streets of Manhattan. And that created so much attention. Even the local TV stations covered the fact that here's this stagecoach running up and down the streets of New York with this Delta sign on it. But the best thing is, I parked that station wagon in front of Eastern's general office for about 2 hours.
So Delta got more traffic, I guess, right?
Absolutely.
As you were leaving New York, the Carter administration decided to deregulate the airline business. Can you tell us a little bit exactly what that means and how that affected the airline industry as a whole and Delta specifically?
Well, prior to deregulation, if an airline wanted to serve a new market, they had to make an application to the Civil Aeronautics Board and justify why they should be allowed to fly from point A to point B if they weren't already serving those markets. And if they wanted to change the fare, if they wanted to lower the fare or increase the fare or make any changes, they had to file these applications with the CAB, and sometimes it took months to get any kind of response back. But when the airline industry was deregulated, all that went away, which means if an airline wanted to go from A to B, they could do it without any approval from anybody and just whenever they wanted to start it. And if they wanted to lower the fares from $200 to $100, they could do that. And there was no control over what people did with fares and markets they served after deregulation was implemented.
So the ability to be able to post fares technologically, was that a challenge?
Well, the problem was when an airline posted a fare, responding to the fare, it was really important you respond quickly so the market would know that you were matching that fare. But you had to have the appropriate technology to be able to respond quickly to changes in the pricing, and unfortunately, Delta wasn't quite ready for that, and that was an issue.
And then ultimately, tools like revenue management, which allow you to determine the right price for the right seats, was that something that came out of this process?
Well, that was down the road a ways, but revenue management was a critical element of it became a critical element of pricing, because you've heard the term supply and demand. Mm-hmm. Well, with revenue management, you could set your pricing based on the demand for seats in that market, on that flight, on that date. Where in the past, before revenue management, you just basically had basic fares right there. All the fares were the same. But if you had a flight that on Friday afternoon, you knew the Atlanta, New York flight at 4 o'clock was going to be full every day, then you charged higher fares than you did on the noon flight that day. So that's what revenue management gave you that flexibility.
So you left New York to become a regional sales manager in Atlanta, is that right?
That's correct.
Then about 9 to 10 months into the job, you got a phone call telling you what?
Well, about 9 to 10 months into that job on a Friday afternoon, Mr. Joe Cooper, who was the Senior VP of Marketing, called me up and said, Bob, starting Monday, you're the new head of the planning department at Delta. And planning was scheduling, pricing, and route development. And I had not worked in that area at all. I was kind of familiar with what it was all about, but I didn't have any experience in that area. So my reaction when Mr. Cooper told me that was, huh? Like, what do you mean? Yep, Monday morning you're replacing Ted Maples. He's reached the mandatory retirement age, so you're the new head of planning.
Did it scare you?
Well,
Should it have scared you?
well, yes, if I had known what I knew by Monday afternoon, that next week it would have scared me. But see, I had been reading all this stuff that the airlines were using pricing. They're using technology and pricing and scheduling and route development. So I just assumed that Delta Planning Department had all those tools. So when I reported down there on Monday morning, the first thing I did was meet with all the managers and ask them, give me a demonstration of the technology we're using. And they all started giggling. And a guy named Mike Bell stood up and said, come here, I'll show you our technology. So we walked around the corner and he says, you see that electric pistol sharpener? That's our technology.
So shortly after deregulation, Delta hit some tough times, is that right?
Well, for a number of reasons, we had a lot of new competition. There were a lot of startup carriers entering the market with deregulation, and a lot of carriers, American, Eastern particularly, and maybe United, expanded into a lot of our markets, and there was just a lot more capacity than there was demand. So the industry started losing money. And for the first time, I think it's the first time in Delta's history since they started carrying passengers, in 1982, Delta lost money that year.
And that was the first time?
Yeah, the first time, to the best of my knowledge, and remember, that was the first time they had lost money.
And then that same year, I heard that there was an act of employee loyalty, which I've never heard of before or since.
Well, a small group of flight attendants organized, got approval from Mr. Garrett, our CEO, to organize an effort at Delta for the Delta employees to buy Delta an airplane. And through payroll deduction, like $750 a paycheck or some amount like that. And the employees and a lot of our vendors pitched in too, bought Delta a 767-200, which became the Spirit of Delta. Wow. I don't remember exact number, but it was about $32 million was what the price tag on that airplane was. But it attracted worldwide attention. I'll tell you what, I had Japanese business people coming to Atlanta to meet with me. Is how in the world did you get these Delta employees to buy this airplane? This doesn't happen in America. Well, it happens at Delta, Bubba.
In the late 80s, early 90s, then you saw the collapse of your biggest competitor, Eastern Airlines, the merger with Western, and then the acquisition of Pan Am's European routes, all of which turned Delta from a relatively small carrier to one of the largest airlines in the world. So getting the right capacity and charging the right prices for this was more important than ever. And as you mentioned before, the revenue management became a very important tool. But then you got a call from Control Data. Tell me about that.
Well, one day I was pretty famous for taking phone calls when people called me, and one day I answered the phone, and this young lady on the phone who introduced herself, and I can't remember her name now, and she told me she was from Control Data, and they had some pricing technology that would make Delta an additional $10 million a year in revenue.
Which is a lot of money, right?
Back in those days, but it was enough to get my attention. And I told her, I said, sweetheart, you and 25 other people have called me to offer this technology, so I don't have time to. She said, Mr. Coggin, please let us come and give you a demonstration, because she says, I want to tell you, we're using this technology at Republic Airlines now, and it's working great for them, but the unions don't like the fact that we're in there, and they feel like we might be threatening job positions by having this technology. So we're having to leave, and we would just welcome the opportunity to come and show you what we can do. So I set up a meeting with all the Delta people who needed to be involved, and they brought their team in. And after hearing their story, we said, hell yes, we'll try this. And the only thing was, we didn't make the additional $10 million that first year. It was more like $150 million.
You oversaw then the expansion of the Delta's network into international markets, the growth of Delta's frequent flyer system, airline alliances with Swiss Air and Air France, the creation of the SkyTeam Alliance, along with massive growth. Any guess as to how much you and your team contributed to Delta during this time?
It would have been very difficult to track the additional revenue. It was significant, but I wouldn't even guess a number.
Does it begin with an M or a B?
It would have been an M back in those days in terms of the dollars of that period. But what it did, it gave us a lot of market access that we wouldn't have had if we had not cut those deals.
In 1991, you were promoted to Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing, and then in 1993, the EVP of Sales and Marketing and Technology. Yet due to the cyclical nature of this business, the industry hit another bump in 1994. How bad was that, and what caused it?
Well, according to some of the reports that I have read, that the period following the first Gulf War and the recession that followed that war, the airline industry in 1994, 95 timeframe lost more money than it had made in the entire history of the airline industry. I saw 2 or 3 different reports to that effect. So it was dramatic, and Ron Allen, our CEO, was determined to reverse that course for Delta Airlines.
And they began to do this with a program called 7.5?
Yeah, we called it Leadership 7.5. Each of the 3 executive VPs were given challenges to find ways to reduce their costs in their part of the operating. And of course, marketing, I had travel agency commissions, advertising costs, personnel, headcount, all of that. I had several areas I could focus on to try to reduce my costs. But thanks to a bright idea from one of my people, not my idea, but one of the staff that worked for me, we came up with the idea of capping travel agency commissions at a flat $25. Prior to that, they were based on a percent of the ticket cost. So instead of paying $85 commission to a travel agent for a ticket, depending on the cost of the ticket, we paid them $25.
Up to $25.
Yeah, max. It was capped at 20. It was a flat $25 fee, and that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in savings for Delta. Made me very unpopular with the travel agency community, but it helped me achieve the goal that I that was set for me to achieve.
And then Delta's profits started to move up at that point?
Delta's profits moved up significantly in 1997 after the Leadership 7.5 was fully implemented. In 1997 was the most profitable year in Delta's history up to that point.
And when was the Olympics?
The Olympics were 1996.
Okay. And what was your involvement in that?
Well, as the chief marketing officer, I was responsible for a significant amount of the activity, Delta's activity related to the Olympics. But fortunately, like most other things, I had some really good people working for me that really managed it. I didn't get involved in the nuts and bolts of it. I was at 30,000 feet, but a young lady by the name of Judy Jordan and a gentleman by the name of Terrence Burns, they were my 2 primary go-to people for Delta's involvement in the Olympics. They did a phenomenal job for me to deliver what we were trying to deliver with the Olympics.
In 1997, the Delta board chose not to renew Ron Allen's contract. That surprised you? Any idea what happened?
No, neither one of the 3, myself, the other two EVPs, we had no knowledge that this was going on, and we never really were ever told this is why the board didn't renew Ron's contract. There was a lot of speculation that the 2 things contributed to it. One was the acquisition of the Pan American routes. That was a very popular decision on some fronts and unpopular on the other. But Leadership 7.5 kind of changed the culture of Delta Airlines, and that the speculation is that had some involvement in the board's decision, but I was never told, and don't know what the deal was. All I know is Ron was a great guy to work with. I enjoyed working with Ron. He was always very supportive, and he was always open to a lot of ideas that I took to him to how we could improve the operation of the company.
And he was succeeded by Leo Mullen. Any thoughts?
Well, you know, a lot of us who just Delta long-time veterans like myself and Maurice Worth and Harry Alger, we were concerned that Leo had no airline experience, and the airline industry is pretty complicated.
But is that unusual, though, not to have airline experience?
It's very unusual to bring a person in to run an airline that didn't have any airline experience, especially at Delta, because if you look back 6 CEOs backwards, they all were people who had come up through the ranks at Delta and knew everything there was to know about Delta Airlines. So there were people like myself who were real concerned that Leo's lack of experience and knowledge of Delta history and culture was going to be an issue, which it turned out to be.
How do you mean?
Well, Delta ended up in bankruptcy.
So you left Delta around this time. When was that?
I left Delta in May of 1998.
How many years had you been there?
42.
And what happened afterwards?
Well, I formed a consulting company, Alpine Marketing Consulting. But the day, I will literally say the day that the press release went out about my retirement, my phone started ringing. People want me to come work for them. And one of the most interesting engagements was with Jay Walker, the founder of Priceline. Jay Walker had been bugging me for months about Delta giving Priceline content to sell, access to seats on Delta airplanes. And he was wanting to always sell our unsold seats. And he was focused on Atlanta. We didn't have many unsold seats out of Atlanta. So Jay called me and says, all right, you've been telling me no now for months. Now, I want you to come to work for me and tell me how I can get airlines to say yes to giving me content. And content is the seats on airplanes. So I accepted a consulting job with Priceline. And Jay, funny thing, Jay says, I can't pay you a lot, but I can give you a pretty good bunch of stock options. So he paid me a small retainer to take the job and a pretty significant amount of stock options.
Was that a move you regret?
That's probably one of the smartest moves I ever made, because Priceline stock went from, you know, I think the warrants were like $1 or $2, I forget the exact price, but they got over 100, close to. By the time I was cashing them out, there was close to $200 a share. When Priceline went public, when they launched, they generated the most revenue a launch stock had ever done before.
Wow, up to that point, I guess.
Yeah.
Subsequent CEOs of Delta, who were they, and then what do you think of them?
Well, after Leo Mullen, Jerry Grinstein, Jerry was the CEO at Western when we merged with Western. He was on the Delta board, and he remained on the board after Ron Allen's contract was not renewed. And when the situation got to the point that Leo left Delta, Jerry was made the CEO, and for a couple of years, as he took the company through the bankruptcy process.
And out of it.
And out of it, yes. And Richard Anderson, who was the CEO of United Healthcare, had been previously CEO at Northwest Airlines. I don't know the details about why he went from Northwest to United Healthcare, but anyway, through the bankruptcy process, Richard was hired to come and be the new CEO at Delta, and he did a phenomenal job. He was one of the most respected and admired airline CEOs in the industry. I went to several trade shows where he was a speaker and involved in people. I mean, he was just phenomenal. And then he decided to retire a couple of years ago, and his number two guy, Ed Bastian, who is now the CEO of Delta, was promoted to that job. And since Ed's taken over, Delta's profitability has been off the chart. I mean, they set a record. They're so far ahead of the rest of the industry. You know, I forget what Delta's market cap is, but I think it's around 40 million.
It is, and it's twice the nearest competitor.
Yeah.
Very impressive.
So it is, and I'll tell you the better part of the story. This is January 2020, and they just declared a bonus, a profit sharing bonus for all the Delta employees, and all the Delta employees got roughly 2 months, the equivalent of 2 months' pay in this profit share. Wow. And there's no other airline anywhere close to that. And if you look at the customer satisfaction rankings and the overall performance of the airline, and nobody else even compares.
Goes a long way to restoring that loyalty, right?
Yes, yes.
So looking back, are there areas that we haven't covered?
Well, one thing that I want to brag about a little bit is I was very involved in negotiating the Delta American Express SkyMiles card deal. And I don't know these numbers to be exactly totally accurate, but the SkyMiles card deal in 2019 generated about $2 billion for Delta Airlines. So that was a pretty significant achievement on my part. And a gentleman who worked for me by the name of Paul Matson, he's due most of the credit. I was just there, but it happened on my watch, so I'm gonna take credit for it. But the other thing, speaking of Paul Matson and him getting credit for that, I enjoyed a lot of success at Delta Airlines, and if you talk to people, they will tell you that I was successful. But it wasn't Bob Coggin that was successful. It was the people that worked for me. They made it possible and they made it happen. Like I made reference to Judy Jordan and a while ago, people like that and Paul Matson and all those people that worked. I had an incredible team working for me. I got a lot of the credit, but they did the work.
In your book, you do a great job, actually, of crediting people that have contributed to your success. Is there anyone else you would like to call out?
Well, you know, I want to go back to you asked a question about Ron Allen's contract a while ago. I think the relationship I had with Ron and his receptiveness to my ideas and things that I felt like we should be changing and doing, I think that had a huge impact on my career and on Delta's success back in those days. So, and there was a gentleman named Charlie Mashman, who is deceased. He was kind of the head of the administration in the sales and marketing division. He's the guy that really made it possible for me to get that sales job in Washington, D.C. He really believed in me, and there was a couple of people that wasn't so excited about me getting that job, and he pushed it and made it happen. So I owe Charlie a huge vote of thanks for what he did for me to help me get that job, because that was the launch pad of my executive career at Delta Airlines.
So long, distinguished career. Proudest moment?
Well, I tell you what, my proudest moment didn't have anything to do with Delta Airlines directly. My dad was an avid baseball fan. He was a Boston Braves baseball fan, and a lot of young people, they don't even know that there was a Boston Braves. But I can remember on Sunday afternoons, my dad and my uncle sitting on the back porch listening to those Boston Braves baseball games on a battery-operated radio. But when I was running New York, I had access to a lot of things, and one of them was tickets to the Mets games. And I was able to get tickets for my dad, take my dad and my stepmother to see the World Series game when the Mets played Baltimore. And I flew my dad up to New York and took them to that ball game. And he just was, I don't think I'd ever seen anybody happier than he was and more excited about anything than going to a World Series game in New York. And that was, gosh, that really got me right here.
Very nice. Going forward, Bob?
Going forward, you know, I am still doing consulting. I do consulting work for the Nassau Paradise Island Promotion Board. But most of my time is spent today in charitable and community stuff. And probably my number one focus is the Boys and Girls Club of Unity County, because there are so many young minority kids today that don't have access to the kind of things we can provide for them at the Boys and Girls Club. So I'm very involved with that, and several other charities. We have a health clinic here that services people that are 200% below the poverty level that do not have any insurance, and I'm very involved. I'm on their board. I'm on their governance committee, and I support them financially. But some of the stories I hear about the treatment that Dr. Crosby provides for these people and the staff at the clinic, it breaks your heart to know that there are people out there that are in that bad of need of health care that aren't getting it unless somebody like the Samaritan Health Clinic provides it for them. So that's where most of my effort and time and resources are going these days.
That's wonderful. Mr. Coggin, it's been a pleasure.
I've enjoyed talking with you, and thanks for taking the time to do this.